completely by surprise and succeeded in driving them back 10 miles, destroying a large number of panzers. The German artillery could make little impression on the heavily armoured Matildas, and in desperation, Rommel formed a gun line made up largely of flak 88s. Firing over open sights, the German guns finally stemmed the British advance. One 88 battery alone knocked out 9 British tanks. Heavy attacks by Stukas later that evening forced the British to withdraw. As the British Expeditionary Force were preparing to attack at Arras, General Weygand was startled to learn that Guderian's panzers had reached the Channel coast the previous evening. The Allied armies in the north were now completely cut off. After much debate, it was decided the Allies would fall back to a new front marked by Valenciennes, the River Escaut, the old frontier position from Molde to Allouin, and the River Lys. A strong offensive was also planned, involving a simultaneous strike from both north and south. While returning to his headquarters, General Biot was killed in a car crash, and it was not until the following day that his successor received the necessary orders. The French First Army was consequently behind schedule. As the Allies effected the withdrawal to their new positions, their progress was severely hampered by the flood of refugees fleeing the advancing Germans and continuous Luftwaffe bombing raids. On May the 22nd, Brauchitsch ordered Army Group A to swing right. It was to head for a line through Armentières, Ypres and Ostend, cutting off the Channel ports as they advanced. Army Group B was to wheel its left flank around to face north, thus strengthening the walls of the trap. That same day, 2nd Panzer reached Boulogne, and on May the 23rd, 10th Panzer invested Calais. While fighting continued to rage around both ports, by May the 24th, 1st Panzer Division had reached the line of the Aar Canal, barely 10 miles from Dunkirk. At this moment, the Germans were closer to Dunkirk than most British formations, and between them and their objective, there stood just one British Expeditionary Force battalion. Total victory was within the Germans' grasp. Yet as they stood poised to deliver the coup de grace, they were stunned to receive orders to halt. The order to halt was issued by General von Rundstedt on the evening of the 23rd, despite Brauchitsch's desire for a vigorous advance. Rundstedt wanted a pause to let his forces regroup. He had lost half his armor in the drive through France, though most of these losses had resulted from wear and tear rather than enemy action. Hitler not only approved his decision to halt the armor, he also gave orders that the halt be made permanent. As the panzers were driving ever deeper into France, Hitler had become increasingly edgy and nervous. He feared that at any moment an Allied counterstroke could cut them off and deny him his imminent victory. Frightened by his own success, he preferred to pull the reins on his advancing columns rather than take any risks. Hitler may even have wanted to avoid destroying the BEF. While visiting Rundstedt, Hitler astonished his generals by speaking admiringly of the British Empire. He claimed all he wanted from Britain was that she acknowledge Germany's continental supremacy. Once France was defeated, Hitler assumed he could make peace with Britain. Sparing the British Army would, Hitler believed, make that peace easier to reach. Above all, there was the influence of Hermann Goering. Goering was eager that the glory of the final victory should belong to the Luftwaffe. He argued that the Luftwaffe was much more loyal to the Nazi Party than the army, and they therefore deserved the honor of the ultimate triumph. The Luftwaffe commander assured Hitler that his air force could finish off Dunkirk on its own. Goering's arguments gave Hitler the final justification he was looking for to halt the panzers. Since May the 20th, a huge flotilla of ships of all sizes was being assembled along England's Channel coast in case the British Expeditionary Force would have to be evacuated. These would later be augmented by thousands of small boats, essential for ferrying troops from shore to ship. Many of the small boats, which included yachts, lifeboats, trawlers and more, were manned by civilian volunteers. The planned evacuation was codenamed Operation Dynamo and commanded by Vice Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay. At 1900 hours on May the 26th, Ramsay was ordered to commence Operation Dynamo. He had been counting on 3 French ports being available for the evacuation, but by now, both Boulogne and Calais had been captured. With Dunkirk the only port remaining in Allied hands, Ramsay feared no more than 45,000 troops could be rescued. On the evening of May the 25th, Lord John Gort had ordered the British Expeditionary Force to retreat to the sea. His decision was prompted by the critical position of the Belgian army on the Allied left. It had already used up all its reserves and was on the brink of collapse. Once the Germans overran the Belgian line, they could then strike at the British Army's exposed flank. Gort felt it was wiser to retreat than comply with Weygand's orders for an attack to the south. The following day, the Germans finally broke through the Belgian defences. Just as importantly, Hitler gave permission for Army Group A to resume its advance. On May the 27th, the exhausted Belgian army could fight no further, and King Leopold asked the Germans for an armistice. By dragging out the surrender negotiations, the Belgians managed to buy their allies an extra 24 hours in the life-or-death race for Dunkirk. Nonetheless, it took hard and desperate fighting by French and British forces to keep their escape routes open. One British division was reduced to the size of a single brigade by nightfall on the 27th. The following day, the Belgians officially surrendered. At Lille, almost half of the French First Army, who had been slow to retreat, were cut off. Despite being surrounded, they chose to fight on, and over the next 3 days would tie down 7 German divisions. That evening, the retreating Allies were hemmed into a narrow bridgehead around Dunkirk, and only 25,000 men had yet been evacuated. But the vast armada of small boats now began to arrive, enabling more and more troops to be rescued each day. Poor weather had hindered Luftwaffe operations during the early stages of the evacuation. The first heavy Luftwaffe raid did not come until May the 29th, but their attacks increased in intensity over the next 3 days. Though the RAF committed every available plane to provide fighter cover, they were heavily outnumbered. Nor could they stay long because of the distance from England. Luftwaffe attacks accounted for 243 ships, including 8 destroyers and 8 troop carriers. Luckily for the British Expeditionary Force, the Luftwaffe failed to put Dunkirk harbour out of action. It was from the harbour, rather than the beaches, that the great majority of troops were embarked. Late on the 30th, the Germans finally realized the scale of Operation Dynamo. It was decided that an all-out effort must be made to break through the British Expeditionary Force defences. On May the 31st, the Allies were forced to fall back to the line of defences along the Franco-Belgian frontier. German pressure on the perimeter continued throughout the next day, and there were further massive assaults from the Luftwaffe. Yet again, the Allied rearguard was forced back, though they managed to prevent a German breakthrough. On June the 2nd, daylight evacuation had to be suspended because of the ferocity of Luftwaffe attacks. But by then, Operation Dynamo was nearly finished. That night, the last British troops were brought safely away. On June the 3rd, the Germans drove the French rearguard, numbering 30,000, into the outskirts of Dunkirk itself. That night, Ramsay's ships attempted to evacuate this last contingent. Their task was complicated by the sudden arrival of thousands more unarmed French troops. These had quit fighting earlier in the week and had since hidden in cellars, empty houses, and anywhere else they could around the port. Now, news of the Navy's last departure brought them streaming onto the beaches, desperate to get on board one of the final ships. In spite of all the ensuing confusion, 26,000 French troops were successfully evacuated. However, as the last ship sailed out of Dunkirk, nearly 40,000 men had to be left behind. This caused immense bitterness amongst the French, many of whom accused their chief ally of abandoning them. Nonetheless, Operation Dynamo had been an astounding success. A total of 338,000 Allied troops had been brought safely to England. Even though Britain had suffered a catastrophic defeat, Dunkirk took on an immediate mythic resonance for the British people. It symbolized their brave and resourceful resistance to German might. To that extent, Dunkirk had a profound inspirational effect, which helped Britain to continue fighting even when, as now, her position seemed hopeless. For while Britain had succeeded in rescuing her army from the brink of destruction, that army was currently in no condition to fight another campaign. Nearly all its heavy weaponry, transport and material had been abandoned, including 2,500 guns, 64,000 vehicles, and well over 500,000 tons of stores and equipment. With the cream of the Allied armies routed in Belgium, it could only be a matter of time before Germany finished off Wegen's remaining forces. In less than 4 weeks of fighting, the French had already lost 30 divisions and most of their armor. Their allies had also been defeated. As for the Germans, most of their infantry had scarcely been engaged yet, and the panzer divisions were now rested and refitted. They had already established large and solid bridgeheads at both Amiens and Peronne. All that faced them was another hastily constructed French line. Wegen's forces were deployed along the line of the